Welcome to Spiritual Direction and Soul Care Sunday Live. Sundays at 2 p.m. Eastern. We're hanging out in our beautiful summer place. Had a wonderful morning this morning, just taking a quiet walk alone to the coffee shop, and the birds were singing, and the wildlife was out, and the sun was dappling the leaves, and it was pretty amazing today. Clouds were unreal, blue skies. Went out to the boat for a little bit with the kids. They've been jumping in the water. Everything's alive and everything's beautiful. And it is great to be here today and to be together. Whether you're watching on the broadcast or the replay, let me know how you're doing and where you're at and how your summer's going. But we've been diving in. It looks like we're having streaming issues with one of our platforms, and that's okay. We'll see how that goes. But wanted to remind us as we're doing this journey, the quest for peace. We've been looking at 5 different elements of the quest for peace. We talked about cultivating peace within. We talked about being an advocate for peace. We talked about acting justly. We talked about justice. And today we're going to talk about offering mercy. And I wanted to remind us that in this particular series, when we've been talking about peace, right? We've been also really exploring how this search for peace, this deep intuition and desire for peace, is a deeply human longing. And it gets expressed in lots of different ways. It gets expressed, each one of these elements of the quest for peace gets talked about in virtually every major religious tradition in the human experience. And that tells us something about this, what I've been calling the deeper wisdom of the spiritual life. It points to something that's innate in all of us, the spirituality that's innate in all of us, whether we see ourselves as religious or not religious, or spiritual and not religious, or, lots of faith, little faith, no faith at all. The quest for peace is about something that is deeply human and gets talked about and expressed in a lot of different ways. And so I'm going to tell you a little story and then about what giving peace, offering peace can look like and how it cultivates peace. And then we're going to reflect a little bit on the different ways these different wisdom traditions have described peace, right? Whether it's the Hindu tradition or the Buddhist tradition or Judaism or Christianity, how Islam talks about peace, how Sikhism talks about peace, how maybe even the Baha'i talk about peace, just so that we can see that all these major religious traditions, right, are getting at something that is deeply human, regardless of the faith practice or non-faith practice you have. And then we'll talk a little bit about some questions for reflection, like we do each time in this series. And so get out a pen and paper and have it there, and you can write these questions down if you want, and you can use them right now. We can share right now. And when we share those answers, or you can journal with them, whatever. And then I'm going to, because we're always committed at Spiritual Direction and Soul Care to insanely practical spiritual tools for the spiritual journey, I'm going to also give you a call to action for today, just like we do in each one of these sections. And then we'll just close with a blessing. Okay. So that's how it's going to do. Susan Henson is here and she says yes with a capital yes. So capital, all capitals, all caps, Susan. So you are excited for Spiritual Direction and Soul Care Sunday Live. And I'm excited that you're here too. Let's, before we dive into all that, now that we kind of have an overview of what we're doing, let's do a grounding spiritual practice with our most basic spiritual practices of giving ourselves the gift of breath and a moment of stillness. It's always good. These are the 2 most basic, easy things that we can do to come back home to ourselves, to bring our minds into alignment with our bodies when we focus on our breath and the experience of this present moment of stillness. So I invite you, whether you are wherever you are, to be comfortable, get into a comfortable position, shoulders down and back if need be. Back slightly arched, spine slightly arched, and simply breathe. Breathe in 2 seconds, out for 5. Do that again. That quick breath in and long breath out. That technique, I can always feel myself just let down almost immediately with the very first one in. Feel my body expand and receive breath, and then out. When we do that longer breath in, we are emphasizing with our very bodies the act of release. It's the act of letting go at the very level of our physicality. We bring our minds into alignment with our breath. Our ability to stand outside of ourselves, we can use that to get perspective or distance on what we're experiencing, our anxiety, but that ability is also kind of a double-edged sword. So we breathe in and out. It's a double-edged sword because we can get stuck in our heads, ruminating, right? Anxiety, that suffering that just comes upon us. We're not doing anything wrong when our minds and our thoughts race. Our minds just do that, right? It's a survival technique. It's a survival awareness that has evolved over time. And so we shouldn't judge ourselves when our minds race, but then we should just give ourselves the gift of breath and stillness. Don't add to our suffering, right? I was talking about this with Jill just yesterday. Breathe in. Our minds can race and create anxiety and anxiousness. And that's a kind of suffering. We're not doing anything wrong. It just happens. But where we make it worse is then when we, instead of becoming aware of it and bring ourselves back to ourselves, bring ourselves back to stillness, we add to the mind, the racing mind with action, with managing, with trying to control. We add to our suffering, right? So this is the gift of grounding. When we feel ourselves anxious, when we feel that uncalled for mental, emotional movement, we have to choose. We get to choose. We have the power to choose breath and stillness. That's what it simply means when you hear people say, I stay in my body, right? It's important to sometimes explain these things as we breathe in and out. Give us a sense of what we're doing. One last one in and out. Amen. All right. How do you feel? I hope you didn't mind that I talked through that. I think it's sometimes important to remind us about what we're doing and how this works and why these practices work. How something very simple like breath and stillness is so key and why it's so simple but powerful, you know? So let's talk about the quest for peace as we continue. This is our second to last session of 5 sessions on the quest for peace. Maybe let me know maybe some of the things that you'd like to talk about going forward as we keep working on some stuff. And I a few weeks ago, I had a book recommendation called It's Not You, It's Everything by Eric Minton, which I am still loving. But I also started this book by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She's a Nigerian writer who lives here in the United States. It's called Notes on Grief. It's a tiny little book, but it is so honest and real, and it has been very healing for me. A little over a year after my dad's death, and the last couple years have been really hard, and there's been a lot of grief, and yet we're doing okay, and we're here, and we're moving forward. And I'm ready for this book, right? Like I'm ready for this book. I can read it and I can see myself in it. It gives me language. I really, really encourage you to read it. It's her description of her grief process after her father died. But I can see how this book would be helpful if you're dealing with grief of loss or trauma of any kind. She really describes the kind of the physical, body, and emotional responses in this really confessional, sort of like honest, authentic sharing style. It's very easy to read. It's lovely. I would really encourage you to read it and pick up anything by Adichie. She's written lots of other books, and she's fantastic. So I highly recommend this book to you as we're getting ready to dive in. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about grief after this series. I don't know. We'll see what happens. Okay, but let me know if there's something that you would like to talk about as well. So today, like I said, we're talking about how to offer mercy. This is part 4, and we're talking about mercy. Mercy, offering mercy. What do you think of when you hear the word mercy? How does your body respond to the idea of mercy? Susan says she's finally been relaxed in the comments. She says, I'm finally relaxed. I've been so anxious today. Like, I'm so glad you're here, and I'm glad you're relaxed. I'm glad you can give yourself the gift of this, and you can give us the gift of your presence as well. So when you think about mercy, maybe that makes you anxious again. I don't know. Like, how does your body respond? What do you feel in your body when you hear the word mercy? And maybe think about that. And then think about the feelings that you attach to, and the ideas that you attach to those physical feelings when you hear the word mercy. Something to ponder, right? Mercy. The teacher and master Jesus says in the Gospel of Luke 6, he says, be merciful just as your Father is merciful. Isn't that interesting? In a different gospel, they tell the same story, but it says, be perfect the way your Father is perfect. They call God the Father, right? This image of deep connection and relationship and identity, the identity giving role of the parent, right? Be perfect as your Father is perfect. But Luke says it this way, be merciful as your Father is merciful. And I think that helps us understand what Jesus is getting at when he talks about perfection. Like, he's not talking about perfection in terms of having everything correct. It's not about control. It's not about performance. Perfection here is a word that's about wholeness, completeness, right? Be whole, right? Susan says when she thinks of mercy, she thinks of God, and she dives into her spiritual space. This is really powerful stuff. Thank you. I love the comments. I always love getting on this and having y'all comment. So please throw comments in. It gives me ideas as well. I love the wisdom in this community. So, but like I was saying, like the mercy that Luke describes Jesus calling us to, right, is described elsewhere as perfection, completeness. Like the whole ball game is mercy. That's how I would sum it up. The whole ball game is mercy. And when you understand that, then you understand what forgiveness really is, right? What the function of forgiveness is for yourself, right? Mercy shows us more about ourselves than it shows us about the person we're giving mercy to. A lot of times we're frustrated, hurt, offended, wounded by people. We focus in on the person and our wound, right? Which is normal. But if we stay there, we give it power, right? We give our wounds power. We talked about that a lot when we first started Spiritual Direction Soul Care, and we should probably revisit that again, right? We had a whole series on forgiveness. You can go look at the videos on the YouTube channel about that. We talked about spiritual wounds and giving the power to our wounds. We should probably revisit some of that stuff. But like forgiveness is about letting go, right? It's about conceptually letting go of someone, showing mercy, right? That's about you. It tells us more about where we're at, right? And mercy, our willingness to move into mercy, right? Our willingness to move into mercy is more of a marker about ourselves, right? To give us a sense of our own spiritual health, right? To give us a sense of our own spiritual alignment, right? Our own sense of like, am I willing to waste a single second of my precious divine energy on some bullshit, right? Like, more and more I'm learning I can't, right? And that's about mercy too. That's forgiveness too, because forgiveness is essentially about letting go, right? And accepting reality, and not letting it become the wound or the pain or the frustration or the anger or the anxiety, letting that become the defining center of how you understand the world, right? But letting things like love and joy and peace, that's what we're talking about, become the defining center of your world, right? When somebody says, I need you to be offended, like more and more that's me too. Like I'm just really trying to learn how not to be in a perpetual state of offense, because there's just kind of like so much craziness in the world right now, right? And people are saying and doing harmful, destructive things, especially in the American context, and I say that because we have viewers in Ireland, we have viewers in Italy, we have had viewers in Japan, we have viewers, all around the world, who watch our videos, and share our videos with people. So, but in the American context, there's just a lot of craziness going on. It's hard not to be angry all the time, right? And it's like, I just got to start saying, I'm busy. I'm too busy for that, right? I'm busy trying to get my peace. I'm trying to be still. I'm busy trying to focus on the good things and the joy and the things that I love and the people that I love, right? This is about giving mercy to yourself in that sense, right? So be merciful, just as your Father is merciful, right? Meister Eckhart, the 13th century mystic, right? He says God is the best name for God is mercy within mercy within mercy, right? That he says the best name for God is compassion and mercy, right? I love that, right? So let's be, as the Christian tradition tells us and the Hebrew tradition tells us, the Jewish tradition, if we humans are made in the image of God, this is how we enact that image, that godlike reality. It's a very godlike thing. It's to be a merciful human being, right? I think that's it's amazing power to be merciful, right? So the tricky thing though about mercy is that when you receive it, right? When you receive mercy, when I receive mercy, it's easy and feels right for us, right? But when you get invited to give mercy, right? I'm not saying it's easy there, right? Like this whole giving mercy thing, I'm talking about how important it is. But all that being said, it's not easy. It's hard, right? Right? It's hard sometimes, and it can feel wrong to offer mercy, right? Especially when we're the one who's hurt, right? So that's the tricky thing, right? So let me tell you a story. It's a story about a guy named Max Ledger and his neighbor, Avi Singh, who Singh is a Sikh last name, right? And it's an example of offering mercy when it's hard, right? So Max Ledger was this guy who lived in the suburbs of Chicago. He returned from serving in one of the Iraq wars to the Chicago area. And around the time he was serving in the Marines. Okay. This is Max, who served in the Marines. And Avi Singh, his wife had died. So he moved to the area to be closer to his kids and moved into the house next to Max's house. Now, Max thought Avi was a Muslim because in the Sikh tradition, the men grow their hair out and then they cover it in those special turbans that you wear, right? And Sikh people typically have gotten harassed a lot for being Muslim, perceived as being Muslim, even though it's a completely different religion, right? And so Max Ledger, who had come back from the Iraq War, even though he knew that Muslims dressed differently, he just assumed that Avi was a Muslim, and because he wore this head covering, right? And he would make loud racist remarks in his house and his backyard about Avi as his neighbor. And when his vet friends came over to hang out with him and everything, they would say derisive and racist and threatening things about the neighbor because these houses are built right next to each other, right? So they could hear this all the time, right? And Max was just hanging out and drinking and getting meaner and meaner and getting a reputation in the neighborhood and clearly racist and having racist buddies over and they're saying openly hostile things about the neighbors. And he just kind of this guy Max just kind of goes into a spiral, right? Like he's being mean, but he's clearly suffering, right? I think that's one of the things about mercy is when someone's mean, there's a part of me that while gets offended too, I automatically start asking, I wonder what's wrong. I wonder why they're hurting, right? And that's what happens with this guy Max. He's clearly hurting. He's spiraling out, and then finally, his wife left him because he didn't want to. She didn't want to deal with it anymore. And so here's this angry dude hurting and being hurtful and living alone in his house. And eventually, he was diagnosed with MS, multiple sclerosis, and as it progressed, um, his drinking buddies would come by until he lost his mobility and he couldn't get around very well. And so he got grumpier and grumpier. His disposition got worse and worse. He's all alone. His buddies stopped coming by to visit him. The only people that ever visited him were his healthcare nurses helping him. And over the years, as this progressed, Avi, the neighbor, watched this kind of downward spiral for this guy, right? And while he was relieved that he didn't have to hear ethnic slurs or, intimations of violence or anything from the drinking buddies, he was also aware that this neighbor was deteriorating significantly and didn't have any visitors, didn't have any real relationships other than the nurses that would come and visit him, right? And he knew what it felt like to be alone when his wife had died years before, because that's why he had moved to Chicago, right? So he found himself knocking on Max's door one day, and he brought him a container of soup. And so he knocks on the door, and Max cracks open the door, right? And looks outside and sees that it's Avi, and closed the door without saying a word. So Avi set the container down on the doorstep and left. And the next week, Avi took a container of soup over to Max again and had the same experience as before. And Avi's doing this because Avi's faith taught him to forgive and offer mercy. And he knew what it felt like to be alone after he had lost his wife to her cancer. And still at the same time, he felt bad that his acts of compassion weren't being received. And so he started to think about maybe I shouldn't go back. And a week later, after doing this for many weeks, he decided to make another batch of soup one more time and knocked on the door. And he was ready to have the door slammed in his face. But this time, the mean neighbor Max opened the door halfway so Avi could see that Max was balancing himself on a walker. And a really gruff voice, he says, "The soup you gave me was good. Thanks." And Avi said, "Well, it was my wife's recipe. And after she died, I try to make it every week because it helps me feel like she's still with me in some way." And Max looked at Avi, and hearing about the loss of his wife softened his heart, a little. And Max said, "Why are you doing this? I know you've heard my buddies and me talking trash about you over the years." And Avi's response was, "Well, I know what it feels like to be alone." And that response really caught Max off guard. And as he looked at the soup container in his hand, he said, "It looks like there's plenty of soup there. So why don't you just come in and have some soup with me? I still have your other containers too." And Avi saw, in Max's eyes, a wounded and tired soul with a spark of light starting to appear. And Avi, with a big smile on his face, said, "Why not? I have to get my containers back anyway." And so as Avi closed the door behind him, his offering mercy gave a little glimmer of peace, of shalom, of wholeness, right? The South African Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who fought against apartheid, said, "Do your little bit of good where you are. It's those little bits of good put together that overwhelm the world." It's like what Mother Teresa says too, we can't all do great things in life, but we can do small things with great love. And that's really the motivation and the heart of offering mercy, right? Mercy heals. In the long run, it heals. It takes work, but it heals. So what do you think? Mercy. What happens in your body when you hear the word mercy? And what are the thoughts and feelings you attach to that? Now, remember, we talked about at the beginning of our time together, we talked about how like mercy is the drive for mercy is this deep human wisdom that gets expressed through lots of different wisdom traditions. That's how I really see religions. Religions are a lot of different culturally described or culturally created specific expressions of trying to figure out the innate sort of human spiritual drive. And lots of different religions talk about mercy. And so let's listen and hear what this kind of, I'm hoping when we read these different scriptures from these different traditions, it helps us see there's this kaleidoscope, this mosaic, right, of wisdom that people in lots of different cultures are trying to get at the same thing together. Okay. So in Hinduism, there's a phrase that says, treat all beings like yourself. Treat all beings like yourself. In Buddhism, it says, teach this triple truth to all: a generous heart, kind speech, and a life of service and compassion are things which renew humanity. I think that's pretty cool. I like that one. In the Jewish scriptures, the Old Testament, as Christians call them, or the Hebrew scriptures, Judaism, Micah 6:8. A lot of us raised in Christianity know this verse as well. He has shown you, O human, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and love mercy and walk humbly with your God. God has shown us, right? Do you see the overlap? How similar that sounds to what the Buddhist tradition says? A generous heart, a kind speech, service and compassion for all. Act justly, love mercy, walk humbly, right? Or like we said at the very beginning, Jesus himself, be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Jesus's image of the great heart, the ultimate center of all things, God, the one who holds all things together, that which is greater than we can conceive and nearer than the air we breathe, is marked that one is mercy and is merciful. In Islam, they say God is the best to take care of humans, and God is the most merciful of those who show mercy. And in Sikhism, Avi Singh's tradition says this: God the merciful has God's self bestowed mercy. God is merciful, has God's own self bestowed mercy. So like what they're saying there is that ultimate reality, mercy flows intentionally and consciously from ultimate reality to us. It's core to the fabric of reality is mercy. That's a pretty extravagant vision of life, right? That mercy isn't just something that we're trying to add in or just happens when we choose it, but it's part of the very fabric of life that ultimate reality wants and desires and has built into all things. And then the Baha'i tradition says this: then standing with open hands, palms upward toward the face, let them say, disappoint not, O God, the one that has with beseeching hands clung to the hem of your mercy and your grace. O you, who of those who show mercy is the most merciful. Isn't this interesting? Each week when we look at this stuff, how each tradition, right, is driving toward these things, and we get this fuller picture in the different ways they describe it, right? We get a bigger picture. We get to see different vantage points about mercy. Right? Judy has a comment here that says, I'm wondering if mercy is similar to empathy, viewing the other not as a being to be judged, but as yourself in another form, undergoing suffering. Wow, that's a mouthful. That is beautiful. Viewing the other not as a being to be judged, but as yourself in another form, undergoing suffering. Being merciful is seeing reality with truth rather than blame. Oh, I- Judy, I just got chills. Lady, you need to write a book. You always have the good comments. That I'm going to be chewing on that all day. Seeing the other not as a being to be judged, but as yourself in another form, undergoing suffering. Yes. Yes. That's another one of those put it on a t-shirt. It's being merciful is seeing reality with truth rather than blame. Yep. Yep. And seeing the reality and accepting it, right? And then moving forward, not in anger, but in a desire to connect. Right. That's what's remarkable about that story about Max Ledger and Avi Singh, right? Is that after years and years of clearly showing that he wasn't safe, Avi still moved in and created relationship, right? Mercy maintains and creates relationship, right? That's pretty amazing. I love that. I absolutely love that. Wow, y'all. Okay, so here's some questions for reflection. So if you're writing these down, you can journal with these, or if you have some thoughts as you hear these things, put them in the comments. Okay. So, first question, rather. When someone makes a mistake in your life, work, family, friends, whatever, do you rub it in or do you offer mercy? Right. I'm not talking about joking around, teasing, right? Like, what's your first impulse? Even if you never say anything to them, is your first impulse to judge and be like, I can't believe that. I can't. It just, you know, like, what's your first impulse? Maybe it's different for different things, right? Some of us have pet peeves or things that we're like, can't deal with that, right? Well, that's great that you can't deal with that. Now you know your growth edge on what you need to grow in mercy and learn to accept, right? You know what I mean? You know? Um, but when someone makes a mistake, what's your default setting, right? What's your default setting? Where do you go first? Right. I think for me personally, I have a pretty big well. Like when I get angry at stuff, I really get angry and I do not suffer fools and I can be very disdainful for things that make me angry. You know what I mean? But I think overall, I'm pretty good at just being like, hey, you know, I don't know what that's about, but you know what I mean? Um, I don't know. How about you? When someone makes a mistake, what's your default? How do you respond generally? Whether you say anything to them or not, right? What's going on inside, right? That's a good way to do it because some of us are trained to be super polite and not say anything, but inside we're talking a lot, right? Outside we may be quiet, but on the inside we're always talking, right? You know. Here's another one. Have you experienced mercy from someone? What's a situation where you're the max? Has someone been an Avi Singh to you, right? In real life. Maybe you're not as bad as Max was, right? But maybe, I don't know. And the last question is this. How have you displayed or how do you display mercy? Like what's your kind of go-to way of expressing mercy when it is time to be merciful? What does that look like for you? Right? Do you go and do kind things? Do you give words of reassurance? Do you simply drop a matter and not bring it up? Right? Let some things lie, right? Sometimes you gotta let sleeping dogs lie, just leave stuff alone is best, right? It just depends. What do you do? How do you show mercy? Judy shares again. I had a dream last night that I was with my guides overlooking a stage set. There was a play going on below involving all kinds of relationships and roles. One character was a little girl who looked at me and was in possible danger. Another was a young man who looked like Jesus. I asked, who am I going to play? The little girl? And they said, no, you are going to be the Christ to all of the relationships. Wow. Wow. You are going to be the Christ to all the relationships. That, y'all, that is how we show mercy. How do you be the most loving Christ-like? Like if that's your tradition, great, right? What's right? How are you going to be Christ in all your relationships? The Christ who told us, be merciful as God the Father is merciful. All the different relationships that you have. Think about all the different relationships you have. Judy Gubinski, man, what a gift. All the relationships you have, all the roles that people play in your life, all the different roles that you play in life. We all wear multiple hats, right? Right? Life can be exhausting, you know? And like, what if underneath each one of those roles, you just said, it's really going to be Christ, the spirit of mercy, the the saying, I'm going to show something divine in the flesh in every role I play, in every relationship I have. Let's say that again. I'm going to show something divine in the flesh. That is who Jesus Christ is, right? In the Christian tradition, we speak of God made flesh, right? Whether you're a Christian or not, right? This is a very compelling image, right? Something divine, something eternal, something healing, something from beyond and transcendent, something beautiful, something good, and therefore deeply true is possible to be revealed in the flesh. That's what's telling us, right? It's the whole thing. It's telling us what we already know, right? That these things are possible and that we can be carriers of these things. This is what the Jesus story is telling us, right? That is what is divine, and that is what is healing, and that is what is true and beautiful and good, and it is possible to enact it in our flesh. That is what Jesus shows us. That's the image that Jesus shows us. That's the way that Jesus points to when he says, I am the way, right? Right? That's the way. It's possible that Jesus comes to show us that in the flesh, human beings can be just like that. And that one of our deepest desires is for the more of things to be set right in that way, that the life is one that is healing and full of wisdom and healing and health and life, right? And right relationship with one another, right? That's wow. Judy, you got me preaching now, girl. What role am I going to play? You are going to be the Christ in all the relationships. Man, take that, put that in your pipe and smoke it, y'all. I'm going to be thinking about that all day too. Man. So here's your call for action today. Okay. Here's your call for action today. Insanely practical. When someone falls, fails, or fouls up, be Christ, offer mercy. Be the Christ in the relationship and offer mercy. And remember, Jesus also goes to the cross. It costs, right? It can be painful, right? It can be painful, but even the sacrifices and the pain can show us that sacrifice and pain shows us the futility of the other way. It shows us the cost of the other way, right? Because everyone was being harmful and blaming and punitive to Christ, but Christ goes all the way to the cross full of mercy to show us that the other way of interacting with each other literally kills people. It literally destroys people, right? Right? So when you think about all the things going on and all the ways that in our society, like it seems like everybody's so angry at small, tiny, vulnerable groups of people and scapegoating people, right? When you listen to the politicians and the cultural thought leaders and all those people, right? Like if they're pushing for policies and attitudes and approaches that are cruel, that harm vulnerable groups of people, you know that that's not of Christ. You don't have to understand or agree with those people, those vulnerable groups of people. You don't have to understand it. You don't have to like where they're at or where they're coming from or what they think. But if you're pursuing a life and policies and laws and a way of living in our society and supporting people, right, that are harming people, right, that aren't full of mercy and driven by understanding, right? And that's not the way of Christ, no matter how correct you think it is, right? No matter how much your reading of the Bible says it's that way, right? Like if it's impacting people that tell you they're vulnerable and they don't feel like you're being merciful and understanding to them, then it's wrong. It's not being Christ in those relationships, right? It's that simple, y'all. It really is. It really is. Man, I have a lot to think about today. And it's like, and to take our own advice, right? Like the people, how do we offer mercy? Here's something to chew on as we go forward. How do you offer mercy to the people who are pushing things that are harmful to people, right? How do you offer mercy to them in a way that isn't enabling, right? Or continuing harm, allowing harm to continue? That's where wisdom comes in, right? And that's the perpetual challenge of mercy that we have to think about. Yeah. Man, good thoughts today, y'all. You guys are amazing as usual. So let me end with a blessing for you guys. Okay. Let's end with a blessing. It also comes out of the Sikh tradition, Avi Singh's tradition. And before we do that, we'll have one last comment from Judy. She says, I think it's important to remind ourselves to be merciful to ourselves too. Yep. Be the Christ to yourself. Identify with your higher self and look with kindness upon your human self in human form. Yep. Bless yourself with mercy. Don't forget to include yourself. So here's a blessing from someone named Gurinder Singh. One universal creator God. Your name is truth, creative being personified, no fear, no hatred, image of the undying, beyond birth, self-existent, by God's grace. O Almighty, you are our master, and to you we offer this humble prayer. This body and soul are all your belonging. You are our mother and father, and we are your children. In your grace, we experience ultimate peace. No one knows your infinite vastness, O highest of the high, most generous God. The whole creation is strung on your thread. That which has come from you is in your will, and you alone know your existence and vastness. We are forever surrendering to you and praying for mercy and forgiveness. Amen. Spiritual direction, soul care, so good to be together. I love it when you guys are on sharing your wisdom. Come and even on the replay, put your comments in and your thoughts. Take those questions. You can go back into the video and get those questions and maybe journal about those during this week and step into offering mercy to as many as you can, being the Christ in all your relationships. You can, if you're watching on YouTube, you can join our growing community at our Facebook page, invite some friends to come over and hang out and get some things going there. And we will continue with Sunday Live. We will have one more part of this series called The Quest for Peace. Next time we meet, we'll be talking about reconciliation, which is kind of like part of the answer to that last question I had, right? About like, how do you offer peace and allow, but make sure that like we don't allow harm to continue as well. How do we do that? Well, that's through reconciliation. And we'll dig into that a little bit more next time we meet. Have a great week. Let me know how you're doing. Let me know if there's any way I can support you, and know that you are amazing. And I absolutely love this community. I absolutely love doing this each week that we connect. Can't wait to see you guys again, and we'll talk soon.